A couple of questions, and I'll try to answer these in one time. So we've got a few questions about congestion on the roads and inability to widen roads. We are definitely sensitive to that. Somebody made a comment about a shuttle. That has been something that we have talked about. We don't, at this time, really know what that would look like. But there are many different ways you could do something like a shuttle. It doesn't have to be mandatory that everybody ride the shuttle. Obviously, when you've got residents and businesses that are, in the gorge, it's not necessarily feasible for everybody that's visiting those to ride in on a shuttle, like what happens at, say, Zion National Park. But there may be an opportunity for a shuttle for other visitors and to get at least one of the cars off of the road and provide, a different type of experience for folks who don't really want to drive, but now they have to because there's no shuttle option. So, funding a shuttle would be a challenge, and so if we do recommend something like that, we'll try to come up with some recommendations for how you might fund it. But we are sensitive to that and recognize that will be something that will have to be addressed. And I think one of the things that is also important with that is that we're going to make some recommendations that are beyond the resort itself. But it's very possible that whatever happens with the resort, that the guests that are staying there are not the ones that are adding to the congestion, because the resort may have opportunities to provide shuttles for them, and that we're going to look at what are those other guests, visitors to the Gorge area. How are they visiting? What are their transportation options look like? And are there some ways to combine and do some things that benefit both, so that we don't have extra vehicles on the road and taking up parking spots. So there may be some opportunities for some co-benefits there, not just resort related, but also for all visitors to the Gorge. So, let's see. We can't answer the question about how many employees yet, because we don't know. We don't have a program yet. We will have that when we get a little further in the study. But we have heard concerns that there may not be enough people living in the area to support the workforce that would be needed for not only a resort, but also additional businesses that we hope will open. But I guess the idea is that if the jobs are there and they pay well enough, then the employees will be there. We know right now that Powell County exports a whole lot of workers. That most of the people who live in Powell County and have jobs don't actually work in Powell County, and so maybe this is an opportunity to keep some of those, and probably the same for the other 3 counties. It could be an opportunity to keep employees in your county rather than having them go work somewhere else. So, we'll see how that plays out, but staffing, may be a concern, but it may be that there's additional, people that move into the area to work at the resort and other business. We'll have to see how that goes. The night sky, that's a good one. So we actually have talked about the night sky, and there definitely are design guidelines for resorts in areas that have the dark sky designation, and that will be part of the recommendations that we make. We're not getting that far in our project to the point where we're designing the lighting for the resort, but we definitely recognize that that's important, and will be something that we put in the recommendations for whoever does design and operate the resort, that night sky designation is important and something that should be respected.
John, I'll mention that my wife and I took it upon ourselves to go visit 7 resorts, 6 of which were in rural areas, one of which was in Southern Virginia called Primland. It's a very high-end resort. It didn't have a whole lot. It's not a perfect prototype for what I think would be appropriate for the Red River Gorge, but the topography, I mean, from the cabins and the residences, you could look out and see 30 miles across the valleys and all, just beautiful. But it was a golf resort, and one of the main features was an observatory, so that on clear nights, they opened the top of this 7-story, the top story was an observatory, and all the lights in the resort pointed downward. I asked them if it was Black Sky certified, and of course that's a very strict certification process, and they said no, but their goal was to have a black sky environment. The only thing that I saw that lit up upward were a couple of fire pits that people would sit around at night with a beverage or whatever, but all the other electrical features pointed downward to keep the night sky clear. Primland in Virginia.
So the tax income, that's a great question. We've been talking about that one. So I think that question is related to the tourism tax that that is in place on room nights. And right now, the way that money is allocated is not necessarily fair, and it's based on state legislation. So one of the things that we've been talking about with the tourism directors, and something that we will be making a recommendation for, and maybe starting that conversation if we can, is having another look at how the tourism taxes are allocated. Right now, they are paid into the state, but then the state divvies them up using a formula that doesn't necessarily reflect how they came in. So what the tourism boards get back from the tourism tax is not directly related to how much goes in. So the other thing that happens is that the tourism boards work really hard to promote their areas on the money that they get, but they're all separate entities. And so, but the state legislation now currently requires that they all be separate entities. And so, one of the thoughts that that came out of some of our conversations was that maybe the legislation should be changed, and if the 4 counties wanted to come together and have a regional tourism board to share resources, that they could accomplish a lot more together than as 5 separate entities. So that is something that we're examining. We can't necessarily come up with an answer for that, but we can start the conversation with folks in Frankfurt and other state representatives from your area to see if that's a possibility for change. But it's
John,
come up. Yeah.
John, I think the target sites, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the target sites that you've narrowed to are all in the counties. They're not in one of the incorporated cities.
Right.
And so the bed tax would go to their tourist authorities and give them more flexibility to promote tourism for their county.
Assuming that they get more back from the state based on the state formula. We can't necessarily assume that because they have more room nights that they'll get more money back from that tourism tax, because that's not exactly how the formula works right now.
I thought there was a 2-part piece to that, part that stays in the county, and then the state adds on, and that's the part that I think some rural areas feel is unfair.
Maybe that's what it is.
Yeah.
The tunnel, that's an interesting question. So we've talked about the tunnel and what kind of recommendations could be made there. We recognize that there are days that it can become a traffic jam, but we also recognize that yes, it is historic. And essentially where we've gotten so far on the tunnel is that at some point in time the road's going to have to be repaved. And when that point in time comes, that may be a good time to look at some sort of signal so that you don't have people driving halfway into the tunnel and then having to back out. But we recognize that what can happen there is limited, but it is something that we are looking at and seeing if there's something we can suggest to the state, to the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet as possible improvements there. But it wouldn't be anything other than at this point in time, the only thing we've discussed is trying to add a signal to avoid people meeting in the middle. So I think I talked a little bit about the favorite places and the protecting sensitive areas. Um, I think that's one of the things we'll have to do once we gather more input on that, is go through and only pull the ones from that we want to highlight that are appropriate for people to visit. Because yes, those of us that have been over there and spent some time in the gorge know that there are a lot of trails to places that there shouldn't be, a lot of trails that really aren't supposed to be there in the first place. So yeah, definitely don't want to encourage more people to use those trails and go to those places. But there will likely be many places identified through that exercise that will be important for us to highlight. We did have an
By the
idea.
way, John.
Yep.
Judge Anderson is one of the participants. I think we're up to 75 participants now, but the judge sent me a text and said the District 10 of the State Highway Department has done a study of signalization on Nada Tunnel.
Okay. Yeah, I think that what came of that, my understanding is that because of the tunnel is historic, there wasn't a good way to route cables through the tunnel to allow the signal to communicate with itself. And because of the topography, a radio signal wasn't a good option. And so it has been, it hasn't really moved forward. So.
There's a company in Louisville that makes some of the most advanced transit signals in the world, and they sell them all over the country. It'd be worth a conversation with them. A lot of it's done by microwave without cabling.
Okay. There was a question about the development plan include ways to contribute to some of the organizations that maintain the natural resources. So that is actually something that came up in some of our conversations, and that's a little further down the road from what we are going to cover in our study. But it definitely is a recommendation that we can make that to the operator, should a resort be built, that that the operator could join the 1% for the Planet program and donate a percentage of their profits to local agencies that do things like conservation. Maybe they do trail maintenance, things like that. So that has come up. It may be a recommendation, but that will be outside of what we actually cover in ours. There's a question about permaculture design and retaining ecosystem health and mitigating development disturbances. If Nancy is still on, I'm going to ask her to answer that question. So yeah. So Nancy, I'm turning on your microphone. If you could answer the question about the design and ecosystem health and mitigating development disturbances, I think you're going to be good at answering that question.
John, there are a couple of Nancys on the call here.
Oh,
you're talking about Nancy Locke, one of your team members, right?
Yeah, Nancy Locke from Stantec.
All right.
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, I think that's really front and center of working in special places, special environments that the reason people are coming to them are those natural qualities, and the last thing we want to do is impact those. And so there are a lot of things to consider, everything from where you site a building to the obvious, like staying out of critical habitat, but thinking about the roadways and thinking about how you gently work with the existing topography to get the right alignments, working with drainage. I think there's been a question about how we're going to address flooding. And I think anything that is developed, there will be stormwater treatment, water quality controls everywhere that will mitigate any sort of additional silting in the drainage ways. But we really, you have to avoid building on steep slopes. And the success of any resort is the experience of being there, and that experience is the place. It's the views, it's the trees, it's the preserved cliffs, it's all of that that are really important, that are absolutely critical. And from a resort perspective, people don't typically travel to resorts that are scarring of the land. It's really about the experience. So I think every step is taken, and it gets down to talking about energy systems too. We at Stantec, we have a team of people that are highly trained and skilled in areas of climate control, climate resiliency, taking a whole systems approach to the resort. Those are values that we bring to the projects we work on, and I think those are especially important when you're considering development in a sensitive area that has a lot of natural beauty.
I'm turning on Kevin Mangan from Stantec. He's currently working on a resort that is using permaculture. I wanted him to talk about that.
It looks like he's muted.
Am I muted now?
Nope.
There you go. We can hear you.
Okay.
We can't see you, but we can hear you.
That's fine. Thanks, John and Nancy. Nancy finished up there with a sort of a great word, or putting this in context. It's really a value sort of proposition in such a beautiful environmental area, and I think that's key to this team and how you meld all this together. But the permaculture question, actually a great question. I am currently working on another master plan. Ultimately, the goal is to provide ecotourism. That does not mean a resort property, but ecotourism to an area in Barbados that is an old sand mine, and probably most of the concrete for the last 40 years that has been poured on that island, the sand out of this mine has been the primary source for sand in that aggregate. They started a permaculture effort about 10 years ago. And so it's a key aspect of obviously the continued study and evolution of the ecotourism. That area, an old big dune, if you will, on the north end of the island, enjoys park setting, natural settings, things like that. And so the permaculture is a large part of it. I am managing that project. I am participating in a leadership role. We actually have a couple of permaculture experts that are part of that team. But the idea of restoration, obviously, in this aspect is an incredibly important thing. And I think what we see as a softer touch on the land here, but permaculture ought to be part of the conversation in the mix of material we bring, and the sort of total and overall benefit that permaculture certainly adds to the work we're doing. So I thought that's a great question, and just at least offer that yes, that we are in the midst of and working in some permaculture efforts, and as Nancy has pointed out, through the course of a number of other resources in the company. Sustainability and these sorts of things are key to what we do, what we bring.
So there's a question about the what's the chain of events after our final report is released, and will it be a private decision after that? And yes, and then there's a question about the public input, things like that. So one of the things I think that is somewhat unique about this project is that you know, there's a lot of opportunity, a lot more opportunity for public input in this process than may have been available had this happened in another way. The fact that the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce and the Red River Economic Development were behind this meant that there was a period, and there is a period for public involvement, and that's why we have our local advisory board, why we have our website, and we have this event and the ones that follow. You know, it could have been possible for somebody to come in and buy a piece of property and build a big hotel, and there be no public input. And so all we can tell you is that you know, we're happy to have it while we're involved in this project and through development of our plan. But what happens after that really kind of remains to be seen. And I think you know, Dave and his organization can help with that, and I think they will. But all of that really remains to be seen once the report is made, right, Dave?
That's correct. Hopefully we've demonstrated a desire to have the community's input, and we hope that that will continue throughout. That's our way of operating. But we will have to take this to the private community and see who, if anybody, is interested in putting money behind it and that sort of thing. So we'll have to see how it unfolds, but clearly we are welcoming public input, and the plan that will be developed by Stantec and will be available, hopefully, we're looking at September, with the delay that I mentioned at the beginning of the call because of COVID. That, I hope, will guide any development that takes place. Keep in mind that at this point, this is the properties we're looking at, with the exception, well, 4 of the 6 properties that Stantec has targeted are in private hands, and that those owners can do whatever they want to very quickly without any public involvement whatsoever. So we have embraced the community and the Red River Gorge United group, which I think is a very positive thing. That group should be involved in the future of the Gorge and stating its opinion on whatever any developer or any entity is doing.
There's a couple of comments and questions about Gatlinburg, and one of the things I guess I would say about that is that we are very sensitive to those concerns. We've heard that from the local advisory board. We've heard that from others. I think that one of the things that is important to note with that is it took Gatlinburg a long time to get to be what it is, and it would take the Red River Gorge even longer to get to be something like that. And what we're talking about is a very small step in adding a number of tourists and activities in the area. Nobody has on our team or any of the folks on the local advisory board have been advocates for a leap like Gatlinburg. So I think that that those fears should not be at the forefront of your minds. That nobody's advocating for a jump to something like a Gatlinburg. And I don't mean to criticize Gatlinburg. Some people really like to go to Gatlinburg, but we're nowhere near that situation, and I don't know that we would ever be in the Gorge, even with whatever resort we end up, or maybe not end up recommending, depending on how the study goes. in the end. But whatever we might recommend is not going to get you on the road to a Gatlinburg, at least not anytime soon. It took Gatlinburg years and years to reach that size.
And John, you've stated two things about Gatlinburg that are different, very different from this situation. One is the time, the decades involved. Two is the scale, Gatlinburg being massive compared to this situation. And the third is that, and I don't know the history of Gatlinburg, but my guess is that the major developers down there did not go through the kind of study and conversation that this project involves right now. The kinds of questions being asked on this call, the kinds of thoughts that are being exchanged about endangered species, about traffic control, about harming the geological asset that is there, and even questions like night sky. My guess is those were not asked in the development of Gatlinburg. In other words, that sensitivity wasn't built into that unfolding development down there over a period of decades. Are there any other questions there, John?
I think we've covered most of them. One thing I would say is I've seen in the questions a couple times the number 500,000 come up. That may have been in one of your previous studies, but we haven't suggested any numbers close to 500,000. So, you know, we're not even exactly sure what the current visitation is because it's hard to get good numbers. There are estimates on the number of visitors, but 500,000 is not a number that we have suggested would be the increase based on the resort. Once we get to the point of having a recommended size and program, we can estimate the number of additional visitors for the actual resort. But one of the things that we believe is going to happen, and something that we can possibly make some projections on, is that there will be, and hopefully there will be, additional attractions and businesses that open in the area, hopefully most locally owned, and that those will drive up tourism on their own, separate from whatever resort might be developed. And so we just don't know yet what those numbers might be, and we can only make estimates based on, you know, what we think might happen in terms of you know, new businesses that open. But I would caution against throwing around numbers like 500,000, because that's not something that we have come up with.
And John, early on in the conversation, back in December, January, along in there, I saw several figures thrown around: 500,000, 1 million, 2 million, even I saw in one place. And I tried to I asked some people, where did that come from? And no one could tell me. I could not find anyone that would put their name on how that ended up on a website or on a petition or whatever. So I think we need to stick with credible numbers, and Stantec will be producing those that we can all look at in the weeks and the next 2.5 months. I've noticed a couple of questions too about the process and why is everything preliminary at this point. Perhaps some folks didn't join at the beginning of the call when I described that I would estimate that Stantec is roughly 1/3 through their process, and most of it has been research and data at this point. No recommendations have been made by Stantec about we ought to do this or develop that. It's data gathering and a community conversation at this point. But in July, we're right here starting July tonight at midnight, August, and somewhat into September, the information will start to flow and this thing will start to gel. So I would encourage patience in that sense. It's going to take a little bit, but we're not too far from having something that we can get our arms around.
There's a question about search and rescue teams. I'm not sure. We'll have to look and see how they get their their funding. I think that that is a conversation that needs to be had already, whether or not a resort comes out of this project or not. That you know, the funding that they get for people and for equipment it may be a conversation that is long overdue. And if there's something that we can do to help speed up that conversation, then we're happy to do that. I've seen a couple comments again about infrastructure. We agree. And so one of the things that we're going to be looking at is it's not just infrastructure related to a potential resort, but are there some grant programs, other financing programs that the existing utilities can use to update their treatment plants, things, to not only to support what they currently have, but to expand service to other areas that don't currently have it. And so we do recognize that need, and that has an impact on everything that happens in the area, and not just a potential resort. So there are some grant programs, there's some stimulus funding out there that we're looking at that could potentially help with infrastructure needs. So that will be something we look at as well.
John, I don't know when you feel like you're at a stopping point. We've been an hour and 15 minutes. We've had a great group. Most of folks have stayed with us, but they'll exit when they need to go on to other things. But we had 75 to 80 people on the call, still 65 right now, according to my list. So that's great.
Yep.
And we will have more, I think, in the future as people get accustomed to this kind of format, if we can offer another one when there is more to report.
Yes, definitely. When we get a little further in the visioning process, we'll have another session similar to this where we get some feedback, and we will be posting things regularly on our Social Pinpoint website. I posted that link in the chat. I can post it again. Some of you may have access to this meeting through that site, so you've been there. But we'll have some exercises on there that help us gather feedback on the next steps as well.
And as I mentioned at the beginning of the call, the project website that we have from our local Red River Economic Development Group is redriverky.com. So there are 2 resources there. We try to post updates regularly, and it links back over to the Social Pinpoint site that John is mentioning and encouraging the survey. Are there 1 or 2 last-minute questions, John, that you'd want to take on here?
I think we've covered most of the ones that we can. I'm trying to see. Amy had a question about the tunnel. Can you decide not to add a signal? Yes, you can definitely have some input on whether or not there's a signal at the tunnel. That was one option that was suggested, but definitely is something that is still up for discussion. And maybe years down the road before anything happens. But please, if that is the consensus, then the Transportation Cabinet needs to know that.
I noticed, John, someone asked, has the Beshear administration been consulted? I've briefed the new Commissioner of Parks, Mike Mangent, and I briefed just last Thursday the new Secretary of Tourism, Arts and Heritage, Mike Berry, and I've gotten some very positive responses from them at this point. Obviously, they have the authority over the Red River Gorge and naturally want to see that property enhanced to the extent that the state has funding to do so. And we assured them that we wanted to work in partnership, but a resort idea like we're talking about, and at this point it's still in the idea category, would operate at a different level and hopefully bring more people to their resort also. We know how important it is to the community and to all the people on our task force are very loyal to that park. Okay.
Actually, I see there's a new question about themed village. Is that still in the plan? Would that include local small artisan shops? So that is something we're looking at. We're not really sure that themed village is what we would end up recommending. What we think that there's going to be opportunities for things like artisan shops and restaurants in multiple places, and some of those are your existing downtowns. And so, it may be that the recommendation is for programs to help entrepreneurs with businesses in Campton, in Beattyville, in Frenchburg, and Stanton, and rather than a themed village. Or it could be that it's both, that there might be some sort of village type place recommended somewhere in the area, filling a certain need. We aren't there yet, but those are some of the conversations that we've had. And having a place for local artists to work and sell their work is something that we have talked about and hope to be able to have some recommendations on. Let's see. I think
there was a question for me here, John, talking about the eco-friendly idea being a good one, but what guarantee is there that after all the recommendations Stantec gives that the final developer will follow any of these recommendations? Will RRED choose who is going to do the development? There is no guarantee. We would be going to the private marketplace, but the work that's being done, the conversations that are being had, the ideas generated by a call like this one tonight are going to go into a report, and a developer will either be persuaded by those recommendations or not. And if they're not, they're probably not interested in doing such a project, and they will know that the sensitivities that are expressed here are on the minds of people. And I think a developer would be reluctant to come in and fly in the face of that. So we hope, RRED, Red River Economic Development, hopes that this study gives weight to local sentiment and the best and brightest consultants we could find in the country to build a body of work that would be so compelling that a developer would want to come in and take advantage of that body of work, those recommendations. So you also asked, will RRED choose who's going to do the development? It's not a matter of choosing. Well, hopefully we will have multiple interest, and that in that sense we would be in the position of choosing. I would hope that that's the case. But if someone came in and proposed something that flew right in the face of all this work that we've done, we'd say, hey, thanks, no thanks. That's not what we're after. So it'll be a dialogue at that time, and there will be periodic public reports as to where things stand. I would emphasize too, as I have in our previous public meetings, that this is all a speculative venture. We do not have a developer standing at the ready, eager to do this. I think it's a matter that we would have to go out and say, here's an opportunity. Could we get someone to do that, or could we get some group of some coalition of interest to do it? So it's I've used the term 50-50 chance that we could actually make something like this happen, but it's it could be very, very positive for the region and worth pursuing, even though maybe it's 50-50. Judge Anderson just sent me a message that local governments, excuse me, let me pull this up on my phone. Local and state governments would likely be involved in incentives that developers would need, so we're not going to not have a say. And that's a good point. As a matter of fact, the state officials, for example, when I talked to the Commissioner of Parks and the Secretary of Tourism, there are some healthy economic incentives for people to develop tourism attractions in the state of Kentucky. Those incentives are on the books. That's not something we'd have to go to Frankfurt and bang on the door and beg for. They're on the books for anybody with a qualifying development. And so in pursuing something like that, which I'm sure a developer would, there would be a dialogue about, well, what are you going to do? How's it going to fit? How's it going to work with the local community? And that sort of thing. So there would be some public oversight both at the county level and at the state level. All right. Well, before we wear everybody out, John, I think maybe we ought to call it to a close and thank everybody for their time this evening. This is the kind of dialogue we want and need, and we will post this call, the recording of this call, on the website, and try to be responsive by offering another one in the future when there's something more concrete to report.
Yep.
Okay.
Right.
And thanks
you,
our
Paul.
friends from Stantec for all the work that you're doing on this project.